After years of coaching people through fat loss, I've come to the conclusion that most people genuinely don't want to hear. Fat loss isn't hard, it's just boring. And I genuinely mean that as a good thing, because boring is actually the answer. Boring is what works. Boring is what produces the result that most people spend years looking for and never quite find, because they keep assuming it must be more complicated than it actually is. So in this video, I'm going to show you why fat loss feels complicated when it isn't, the one thing that actually drives it when everything else is just noise, and the simple system that makes the boring version much more manageable enough to actually stick to. Because I've been a personal trainer for 11 years and delivered over 8,500 one-to-one sessions and trained myself for 14 years. And the clearest way I can show you what I mean starts with the thing that trips almost everyone up who comes to me having already tried everything else. And to explain why boring is the answer, I need to be completely transparent about something first, because I spent years doing this wrong myself before I figured it out. Bulk phases, cut phases, different protocols every few months. I tried a lot of approaches, and the honest truth is that none of the complicated versions actually worked as well as the boring ones I eventually landed on. And once I understood why, I started seeing the same pattern with almost every person who came to me having struggled with fat loss for months or years. For example, they tried different things, usually a lot of things, keto for a few weeks, then intermittent fasting, then some variation of cutting carbs, then a detox, then back to counting everything obsessively. Each approach starts with genuine commitment. Results do come early, sometimes pretty bloody quickly, and then they slow down, and the approach starts to feel unsustainable, and they start questioning whether it actually works long term. And then they switch to something else and repeat the whole cycle again. And here's the thing about all those approaches. Most of them work, at least to a point anyway. They all work through the same mechanism, and when the results slow down, it almost never means the approach has stopped working. It means the deficit has disappeared, or the approach is just far too rigid to bend around real life. All the novelty is wore off and the motivation completely went with it. The problem was never the approach. It was the expectation on that fat loss should feel like something dramatic, noticeable, consistently rewarding week to week. And when it stops feeling like that, when it becomes boring, most people assume something has gone completely wrong and change everything. And I know this because I've done it as well. And here's what I finally worked out after years of watching this happen and experiencing it myself. The boring version is the right version. The drama is what keeps it from working, just like a relationship. The framework I'm about to give you is built into the Softer Lean program, which is in the description. The full structure, full body workouts, it's completely free, built for people who don't want to spend hours in the gym. So here's what fat loss actually comes down to. And I want to say this as simply as possible, because the fitness industry has done an excellent job of making it sound more complicated than it is. Consistent deficit over time, that's it. Not the perfect diet, not the optimal meal timing, not the right supplement stack or the right training protocol. A consistent deficit maintained over months, not just Monday to Thursday. That's what drives fat loss. Everything else is either helps create that deficit or gets in the way of it completely. And here's the bit that sounds obvious but isn't. The problem almost never comes down to which diet someone is following. The weekdays are usually fine, but the weekends are where the deficit completely disappears. Restaurant meals that are far bigger than expected. A few drinks on a weekend with friends at a bar, which you don't really notice the calories. A Sunday that is started with good intentions and went completely sideways by the evening. None of it feels like overeating, but across 7 days, the maths isn't there. And because the maths isn't there, nothing moves. And because nothing moves, they assume the approach isn't working and switch to something else. And then the cycle just starts again. Does that sound familiar? Because this is the thing I see most consistently across hundreds of clients I've worked with. The fat loss problem is almost never about which diet someone is following. It's about whether the deficit is actually happening Monday to Sunday, and not just when the routine is in place. And here's something worth understanding, because it explains why fat loss often feels easier at the start and way harder later on. And most people interpret that the complete wrong way. So when you first get into a deficit, progress does come quickly. And I've seen this with multiple clients when they first come on board. The early losses are a combination of actual fat loss and some water weight shifting as the body adjusts. It feels like the approach is working brilliantly. The scale moves, the clothes feel different, the momentum is there, which is great. Sam is a good example of this here. He had more content knowledge about fat loss than most personal trainers by the time he started working together. He had been consuming videos, articles, all that stuff for months before actually doing anything. And when he finally started, the progress came fast. He thought he'd cracked it, and then it slowed down, the way it always does once the early easy wins are done. And it's not because anything had stopped working, it was because the actual work of maintaining a consistent deficit week after week, month after month, was what remained. And that's where most people either push through or start looking for a new approach that recreates the early momentum. So about 6 weeks in, Sam came back and he said he was thinking about switching approaches because nothing seemed to be happening. I showed him the data from the previous 6 weeks. The progress was there, just a little bit slower. He'd been looking at week to week and completely missing the month to month picture. But once we actually switched his mindset to see it that way, he pushed through the boring phase, and the results that came on the other side of that after another few months, the ones that came slowly and consistently rather than dramatically, are the ones that actually stick. So here's the practical version, the equivalent of micro progression for muscle, applied more to fat loss. So instead of slashing everything dramatically and trying to create the biggest possible deficit as fast as possible, which produces the fastest early results and is great for a certain portion of people, but a lot of the time with some people it's the fastest to eventually burn out. You make small consistent adjustments and stack them over time rather than overhauling everything at once. So you actually find the one or two things creating the biggest gap between what you think is happening and what actually is happening. For most people, that's the weekends. Or it's the incidental eating that doesn't feel like you're eating that much. Or it's protein being lower than they think, which means hunger is harder to manage than it needs to be. Fix one thing, make it consistent, then add the next adjustment. Stack them slowly over weeks and months rather than trying to change everything at once. And here's where most people skip the most important step, which is the assessment week, which is 1 to 2 weeks of tracking before changing anything, just to understand the actual picture, because without seeing the picture clearly, every adjustment is just guessing. Most people jump straight to changing things without ever understanding what their normal week actually looks like across all 7 days. Nobody builds significant wealth by making one massive high-risk bet and hoping it pays off, apart from the apparent trading bros online who seem to know everything. A lot of the wealthy people build it by making consistent small contributions over a long period and letting the compounding do the work. Fat loss works exactly the same way. Small consistent adjustments over months and years produce results that dramatic short-term efforts almost never sustain. Now don't get me wrong, I run a group coaching program a couple of times per year, which is an 8-week shred, with the goal being to shred quite a lot of body fat in a relatively short period of time. But with all those clients, I set them up into the next phase after that 8-week shred so they know what to do, so they don't put all the weight back on. I've got another client here, Jimmy, who showed me this most clearly because his situation is the one I see most often with people who've been genuinely trying and genuinely not making progress. So he was trying for years to lose the same body fat, the same weight, and he wasn't half-arsing his efforts. He was genuinely committed to doing it. He was training consistently, eating well during the week, did everything that looked right on paper, but the weight hadn't shifted in any meaningful way across years of real effort. So when we sat down and looked at the full week, not just the weekdays, the picture became pretty clear. So it was Monday to Thursday, the calorie deficit was really good. He was eating really well. But as soon as we hit Friday evening, all the way to Sunday, it completely disappeared. And it wasn't through anything dramatic, just through the normal social eating and weekend patterns that looked pretty good in isolation, but added up across the week. And when I showed him the numbers from that assessment week, and it was the first time he'd properly tracked everything meticulously, he went quiet for a second and then just said, that's years of doing that. And that stuck with me. 4 years of genuinely trying, and the answer was just sitting in the weekend eating pattern or a few drinks with the lads the whole time. Not because he was doing anything dramatically wrong, but because he just hadn't seen the full picture clearly enough to know where the one small adjustment needed to happen. And it was visible within a week of actually tracking it. And with just a few weeks of tracking his calories on weekends, it was noticeable almost straight away. And it wasn't through a new approach or a more sophisticated diet, just through understanding where the gap was and making the boring adjustments to close it. So if you want the full structure that makes all of this manageable, the Softer Lean program in the description has it completely mapped out from day one. It's built for people who don't want to spend hours in the gym. And here's why the boring version is actually the right answer for you, because I know it doesn't feel satisfying to hear. Dramatic approaches feel like they should work better. That's why online there's always the next new diet or the next new shake or the next new detox. It's because it captures your attention. It hooks you in. A bit like I try to do with these YouTube titles and thumbnails. Extreme restriction for a short period, get the result fast, then go back to normal. It makes intuitive sense and it produces results for a while. But the problem with dramatic is that it requires the conditions that made it dramatic to continue. And those conditions are almost never sustainable, unless you set it up right, like I do with my group coaching clients. But the boring version works, and the dramatic version feels better for about 2 weeks before it stops. That's genuinely the choice. For example, I've got another client here, Cash. He actually laughed when I showed him the plan because he thought I was just joking. He'd expected something way more complicated, some really complex protocol that matched the seriousness of the goal he had. He said it looked too easy, but 12 weeks later, he was in the best shape of his life at 39, not because the approach was clever, because it was simple enough to actually sustain around a demanding job, kids, and a life that had no room for anything complicated. It was boring, it was sustainable, but more progress in 12 weeks happened than he managed in years of trying more complex, harder things. Fat loss really is this boring. A consistent deficit over time, protein sorted, the full week tracked honestly, rather than just the weekdays where everything's going well, and the patience to keep going through the phase where progress slows and everything in you wants to switch to that shiny new thing. And I know it's not what most people want to hear, which is exactly why most people are still looking for a better answer years after they should have stopped looking. But here's where most people hit their wall even once the fat loss is actually happening, and the boring version is working. There's one specific phase that almost everyone finds harder than they expected, and understanding it before you get there is what separates the people who get all the way there and get to low body fat and feel great in the way they look from the ones who get close and then just completely reset. And I've got a video that covers exactly what it is somewhere over here, so watch it next.